This is the Camp Iron Mountain Podcast, a place to learn about U.S. military history as told through the stories of service members, military units, and supporting civilians. Join us as we work to preserve their memories for future generations. Welcome back, everyone, to the Camp Iron Mountain Podcast. I'm your host, Gabriel Suarez. We're trying something new for this week's show. We're going to tell the stories of two similar events whose anniversaries happened during the same time period in late March, early April. This two-part series will present stories from two of the U.S. Army's longest armored drives. Following the introduction of tanks at the end of the First World War, maneuver forces have been able to attack over longer distances and deeper into enemy's rear area than in any conflict prior to the early 20th century. In the first part, Episode 6, we'll share the story of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division's attack to help close the Ruhr Pocket and capture the German city of Paderborn in World War II. During their historic drive on March 29, 1945, 3rd Armored Division covered a distance of over 90 miles against the enemy in just over 16 hours. It was recognized as the longest one-day armored attack of the war. Most of the episode will be told through first-hand accounts of soldiers who were there. This provides a fuller understanding of what was experienced by these men during this important week of action. The second part, released as Episode 7, will focus on a company commander's experience during the ground invasion of Iraq in 2003. Some of the attack distances our guests went through would equal or surpass the record set by the 3rd Armored Division 58 years prior. To commemorate these two events during the anniversary dates from which they took place, I'm going to release the second part next week instead of on our normal new episode schedule of every other week. I hope you enjoy Part 1. Spearhead closes the Ruhr Pocket. In early March 1945, the Allied armies in Europe had Nazi Germany on the ropes. The Red Army was arrayed along a line approximately 60 kilometers east of Berlin along the Oder River. Allied forces in the west were quickly closing in on the Rhine River. Following the breakout of the Normandy hedgerows in July 1944, the 3rd Armored Division found itself as the vanguard of the U.S. Army's 7th Corps. The division was led by Major General Maurice. Rose distinguished himself during earlier fighting in Sicily and during the Normandy campaign as a commander of Combat Command B in the 2nd Armored Division. Promoted to commander of the 3rd Armored Division in late July 1944, General Rose, through his incredible force of will, molded it into one of the best fighting divisions in all of Europe. His aggressive style pushed his commanders and troops to their limits and often beyond. Leaders who couldn't keep up were relieved. Often found near the head of his attacking division, General Rose inspired great loyalty among his men. In leading the U.S. First Army across northern France, Belgium, and into Germany, the 3rd Armored Division earned the nickname of Spearhead. Though Rose led his division through many incredible engagements across Europe, his reserved manner of never seeking publicity, combined with him being singularly focused on accomplishing his mission, kept the 3rd Armored Division's exploits largely off the front pages of the newspapers back home. By late March, the Western Allies planned to cross the Rhine River and attack into the Ruhr region of Germany, which was the country's industrial heartland. The primary crossing of the Rhine was planned to occur in the north on March 23, 1945. This massive operation, named Operation Plunder, was led by the 21st Army Group, commanded by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The 21st Army Group consisted primarily of British, Canadian, and American troops. At the same time, a supporting attack across the Rhine was planned to take place south of the Ruhr region by General George Patton's U.S. 3rd Army. But with tacit approval from his Army Group commander, General Omar Bradley, Patton's 3rd Army troops crossed the Rhine first, a day earlier, and established a bridgehead on March 22nd to try and upstage his rival, Field Marshal Montgomery. After receiving worldwide acclaim for its capture of Cologne on March 6th, the 3rd Armored Division was living a life of rest and simple security missions. By not taking part in any of the Operation Plunder actions, Soldiers of the 3rd Armored Division were already hearing rumors that their war in Europe was finally coming to an end. A lot of these rumors were probably the after effects of the multiple cases of confiscated wine captured in the city. The general feeling among the men was that they had done their part, and now it was time to let those newly arrived divisions finish the job. But fate would not let that be. Advancing quicker than anyone thought they would, the 9th Armored Division of the U.S. First Army reached the town of Remagen on March 7th and were stunned to see one of the bridges over the Rhine River still standing. Due to the courage and initiative of junior soldiers, the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge before the Germans could blow it up. The battle for control of the Ludendorff Bridge lasted over the next 10 days, with the Germans using virtually every weapon at their disposal to try and destroy the bridge. Before its collapse on March 17th, the U.S. First Army was able to get 5 divisions over the river and establish a bridgehead. Capturing the intact bridge forced General Eisenhower's hand and led to a change in plans in order to exploit this unique opportunity. The U.S. First Army would now be used to break out of the German defenses and help cut off the industrial Ruhr region and trap hundreds of thousands of enemy troops still in it. According to the 3rd Armored Division's official World War II history, Spearhead in the West, the orders came down from their higher headquarters on March 24th that the 3rd was moving out the next morning in a full-scale attack. The authors write, "This was the beginning of the big push. There was victory in the air and it was contagious. The American 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies were already across the Rhine. So were Field Marshal Montgomery's forces. Now General Courtney Hodges was preparing a haymaker to the heart of Germany, a drive to isolate the Ruhr. The battering ram he chose for this stupendous task was Major General J. Lawton Collins's 7th Corps, and again, as so often in the past, the 3rd Armored Division was scheduled to lead the attack. At dawn on March 25th, the 3rd Armored Division launched their attack out of the bridgehead on a wide front. They passed through the positions of the grimly faced, battle-weary doughboys of the 1st and 104th Infantry Divisions who'd opened the way for this move. The 3rd Armored Division was organized into 3 combat commands. Combat Command A attacked in 2 columns on the left. Combat Command B attacked in 2 columns on the right. Combat Command Reserve followed closely behind, ready to intervene in either zone if committed. In the breakthrough zone, 3rd Armored Division battled through 6 depleted German divisions. For this attack, the 414th Infantry Regiment of the 104th Infantry Division was attached to the 3rd Armored, beefing up its total combat power for what many were hoping would be the final major attack of the war. In addition to the extra infantry, the 3rd Armored Division had total air superiority over the skies, with the 9th Tactical Air Force providing close air support to its lead formations. John Irwin was 18 years old when he joined Company I, 33rd Armored Regiment, Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division as a replacement tank gunner in late March 1945. The breakthrough attacks from March 25th through the 27th were his first days in combat. These recollections are from the book he wrote in 2002 about his experiences during the war. For reference in the story, Joe Matera was his tank commander, and John Smitty Smith was his loader. All around us, the sounds of shellfire and small arms in the vicinity told the story the division had almost immediately run into severe resistance, and Joe picked up on the radio that Company B had already lost 3 tanks to landmines. "Gunner," Joe shouted. "Armored on the right, about 600 yards. Fire AP!" I shouted the order to Smitty and heard the clank of the breech closing as I found the armored car in my sight and fixed it into my crosshairs. "On the way," I called out as I tramped on the firing solenoid on the turret floor. I saw the tracer and smelled the ammonia of the expended shell. "Okay, kid," shouted Joe encouragingly. My right hand was trembling as I gripped the handle of the power traverse which rotated the turret and controlled the gun elevation. "Down 100! Fire!" I dropped the elevation and fired again. In the scope, I could see the tracer drive right into the side of the German armored car. My first score in actual combat. I saw Smitty die that second day of combat, and I felt numb. For the first time in my life, I became a believer in a personal death. As awful as that experience was, I had reason to be grateful for that revelation. I would owe my own survival to it. It shouldn't have happened, of course. No one is supposed to die, at least not that young, or in that way. But Smitty was dead, and somehow I felt as though I was to blame. 25-year-old Donald Willis was assigned to the crew of an M3 half-track in the 3rd Armored Division's 67th Armored Field Artillery Battalion. In the turret, he operated the track's .50 caliber machine gun, providing security for the battalion's howitzers and supply vehicles. These descriptions are from a book he wrote in 1988, based on a diary he kept during the war. The 3rd Armored Division broke through the enemy defenses today. We're moving fast as town after town falls before our assault. Seems almost impossible that we could be covering this much ground in our advance. This is similar to the breakthrough at Senlo. Clouds of dust cover our route as we push forward. As I glanced around at my buddies wearing goggles, I'm reminded of science fiction, for they look like men from Mars. Cakes of dust and sweat cover us. Many bottles of cognac are emptied on this drive. Our route is becoming littered with many enemy tanks and other vehicles. The deadly P-47 Thunderbolts have spotted German convoys and are raining destruction upon them. As we drive even deeper into the center of Germany, another spectacle is before us. The slave laborers of Europe are everywhere on the road, sometimes causing traffic jams in our convoy. They trudge happily to the rear, waving and shouting to us. They seem to be in very poor health and are all walking. Record numbers of enemy are being captured, so many that at times we don't have the means or the time to bother with them. Many seem glad to surrender, but by no means are they quitting. Still, very hard fighting and hardships are ahead for our troops. On March 26th, infantry from Company A, 36th Armor Infantry Regiment were riding on top of tanks in Task Force X, Combat Command A, as they approached the woods outside the town of Alterkirchen. As they halted briefly at what looked like an abandoned roadblock, 8 German anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the tanks. The 20mm explosive shells couldn't penetrate the tank's armor, but the infantrymen riding on top were completely exposed. The infantrymen hung on for dear life as the tanks quickly maneuvered to get out of the kill zone, hoping the incoming fire didn't find them. Unfortunately, multiple men were hit, and the hot still causing horrific injuries. One tank carrying a squad from Company A's 3rd Platoon skidded off the road and slammed sidelong into a tree. The doughboys went flying off, except for one unfortunate man who found himself pinned between the tank and the tree by his ankle. Clyde Grubb was one of the Company A soldiers wounded during this ambush and taken prisoner. The following clip is from a video interview he filmed for the Company A Historical Collection.
So we just cleared this town, and the tanker started swiveling his turret around to the left. There was a whole mess of 20mm guns on the left, and I was over on the right-hand side, and I had nowhere to go. I dropped my rifle and grabbed it for a cleat to the duffel bags on the side. I couldn't do it. Down I went. And I was under a tree backward, and I must knock myself out for a little bit and come to and rolled over. And I looked to hear a tank was coming down off of the road, like a road with higher by a 4-foot ditch. I slanted. And I thought, man, what am I going to do now? Sure, he finally got up on the road again, but about 12, 13 guys threw off by that sudden torch. So here comes a guy down there. West ran for a house. One guy comes down toward me, which was Bill Carrier. And he had a 38, P-38 and a Luger and a couple of watches and an SS thing on his suspenders. And he wanted to give me the watch, the Luger and all that. So I don't want with it. So what am I going to do? I said, throw him out in the fields. So he finally got his SS things off and everything threw him away.
Byron Mitchell and 4 of his fellow infantrymen found cover in a roadside ditch. But by the time the incoming fire stopped, their tanks and other Company A comrades had escaped the area. They were all alone. The Germans made their way down the hill and captured them. The men were marched back to the local German headquarters where they were interrogated and held for 2 days. At one point, the Americans were given shovels and told to start digging ditches. Knowing there wasn't a need for them to dig foxholes, the men quickly understood that they were digging their own graves. Later on, a German tank column passed by. The sight of American prisoners digging ditches caught the attention of one of the passing tank commanders. He stopped his tank. The commander climbed down and stormed towards the Americans and their captors. He grabbed the nearest German guard and pulled the man aside and began screaming at him. After the commander finished lecturing the guards, the prisoners were instructed to put down their shovels and were taken to a nearby farmhouse. The Americans were locked inside while they could hear the guards load onto trucks and leave the area. Soon new vehicles could be heard pulling up outside the farmhouse. The door was kicked open and a man stepped inside with a weapon in his hand and a 3rd Armored Division patch on his sleeve. Early on March 27th, exciting news went out over the radio nets. Task Force X from Combat Command A had broken into the clear and was smashing through town after town. Not long after, the other Spearhead task forces did the same thing and were off to the races. The 3rd Armored Division fought for 72 straight hours without rest or maintenance before stopping on the east side of the Dill River at Paderborn. Combat Command B was able to reach as far east as the town of Marburg before finally halting. In the 3 days from March 25th through the 27th, 3rd Armored Division advanced over 70 miles through enemy territory. As the men and tank crews of the 3rd Armored Division spent the day resupplying, generals high above them were meeting to dramatically change the direction of attack and their fates. The order came down from the top on the morning of March 28th. 12th Army Group Commander General Omar Bradley ordered the U.S. First Army, commanded by General Courtney Hodges, to halt its easterly attack, pivot 90 degrees, and attack to the north. The goal was to link up with the U.S. 9th Army near Paderborn and close the Ruhr Pocket, completing an encirclement of the German forces in the region. During an afternoon conference at the 3rd Armored Division headquarters near Marburg, senior officers from the 7th Corps, the 9th Tactical Air Force, and the division gathered to coordinate the shift to the north. Among the group was the 9th Tactical Air Commander, Major General Elwood R. Pete Quesada, an old friend of Maurice Rose's, who was responsible for providing close air support to the U.S. First Army and its components. During the conference, General Collins publicly needled Maurice Rose about the 4th Armored Division's exploits that continued making headlines. 3 days earlier, Collins had first teased Rose about their rivals and Patton's U.S. 3rd Army getting all the publicity for the recent long armored drives of over 50 miles in 2 days. Always the respectful subordinate, Rose had endured previous goadings in silence, but this time he couldn't restrain himself. Specifically embarrassed in front of Quesada, and in a moment of stung pride, Rose boasted aloud in front of the senior officers, including Collins, that he would be in Paderborn by the middle of the next day. The officers in the conference were stunned and immediately fell silent. Paderborn was more than 100 miles from Marburg. The 3rd Armored Division staff set the lineup and briefed the Combat Command leaders on the next day's plan of attack. Combat Command B and Combat Command Reserve would move north abreast of each other along 4 axes of advance, with Combat Command A trailing as a reserve. The armored task forces were ordered to move as fast as they could, bypassing all resistance the best they could. This meant that most of their movement would eventually move off-road in order to avoid towns and get around roadblocks along the way. The trailing 1st and 104th Infantry Divisions would handle the bypassed enemies as they moved up. This moment was a big deal for Combat Command Reserve, who rarely got the opportunity to lead a major attack. Its commander, Colonel Robert L. Howes, Jr., provided simple instructions to his armored task force commanders. Just go like hell. By the early morning of March 29th, hundreds of Spearhead vehicles were lined up for miles behind the line of departure, grouped in 4 separate columns ready to go. As the division started its attack, General Rose radioed the task force commanders, offering a bounty of 1 case of scotch for capturing the following dead or alive: Guderian, Himmler, Kesselring, or Dietrich, and 1 bottle for Hitler. Rose issued the challenge over unsecured radio channels in hope that the dispatch would be intercepted by the Germans and words carried back to Berlin. The attack north started at 0600 hours and rolled until 2200 hours that night. There was little to stop the advance. Even though enemy troop vehicles and installations were encountered in large numbers, they were completely surprised and disorganized. Over long miles of each route, the long armored columns were forced to travel cross-country to bypass roadblocks and stretches of poor roads or weak bridges. Along most of the way, the 4 routes were separated by 3 to 5 miles of rugged western woods country. To get from one column to the other, it was necessary to use artillery liaison planes or travel all the way back to the line of departure, then cut over and get on the route desired. Even this latter method was unsatisfactory because the spaces between the routes held many bypassed pockets of resistance. These pockets of enemy continually infiltrated across the 3rd Armored Division's routes of advance. Supply vehicles had to be strongly escorted, and even so, several were lost to ambushes. Liaison officers frequently traveled in light tanks or armored cars. The day was overcast, and air support was noticeably missing, but there was no need for it. The enemy flank had been turned, and there was nothing he could do to stop the slashing attack. Burning German vehicles dotted the countryside, and prisoners marched back to collection points almost in an unbroken line. Donald Willis of the 67th Armored Field Artillery Battalion noted the dangers he faced that day in his diary. Our ammunition train made a hurried trip to the rear area for more war supplies. Roads are jammed with troops moving up to the front. It's very dangerous on these trips as many of the bypassed areas are still held by enemy troops. We have no heavy armor or large guns, so we must depend on speed and machine guns. When attacked, our troops raked the terrain with heavy fields of fire. Combat Command B on the right had its own share of challenges. Prior to the main force kicking off that day, Task Force Lovelady's reconnaissance company moved out of Marburg in order to find the best route leading north. At the first town of Colby, they hit a hornet's nest of small arms, Panzerfaust and mortars. They were trapped with nothing but thin-skinned vehicles. In the end, several of the light tanks were destroyed, and many of the reconnaissance soldiers and officers were killed or wounded. The tank gunner John Irwin recalled crossing paths with some interesting people during their drive north. The one thing, however, that really stuck with me was the sight of the crowds of refugees we saw that day walking and stumbling along the roads leading away from the city. Old people, small children, mothers with babies slung across their fronts, carrying whatever they could. Some pushing wobbly baby carriages or pulling little wagons loaded with their belongings. It was a sight I would see too often. Sometime late in the afternoon, a peep carrying 2 men came alongside our tank. The one on the passenger side was obviously an officer. He had a crew cut, stiff graying hair, a serious, handsome face, and a big frame. He looked up at us, touched his forefinger to his brow, saluted, and said, "My helmet's off to you, men. Keep it up." "Know who that was?" Irvin's new loader asked as the peep moved ahead, stopping briefly alongside each tank. "No," I shouted as the engine roared. "Who is he?" The loader grinned slightly. "Just the best officer in the whole goddamn U.S. Army. That was General Rose, division commander." In addition to refugees, slave laborers poured out of the factories and farms as the Americans passed by, greeting them joyously on their day of liberation. A constant stream of these happy folks lined the road as they immediately started towards home. When the attack halted that night and odometers were checked, elements of the 3rd Armored Division covered over 90 miles in the lightning advance to Paderborn, though they came up about 20 miles short of the city. Nevertheless, it was the longest single day's advance of the entire war. Andy Rooney, who later in life became a noted essayist and commentator, was an enlisted soldier and reporter for the Stars and Stripes newspaper during World War II. He chose to cover the 3rd Armored Division's breakout and eventual drive north to Paderborn. In his 1995 biography, My War, Rooney recalls an experience he had interviewing General Rose during the Paderborn attack. I was hanging around a tank crew on the side of the road when a major came up in a jeep and said, "General Rose would like to see you in his headquarters." Here I was, a sergeant, reporting for the Army newspaper, and this tall, handsome, 45-year-old general was inviting me into his command post for an interview. "I take orders from the Corps commander," he told me. "He just tells me where he wants 3rd Armored to go. He doesn't tell me how to get there." "When do you hope to reach your objective?" I asked General Rose a little stiffly. We didn't talk about specific objectives because of censorship, and I wouldn't have been allowed to name them in my story anyway. "Tomorrow," he said. "Wow, you think you'll really be there tomorrow?" "You said hope?" Rose replied. I was amused by the play on words by the general. When a general is even a little funny, it's an event. Paderborn was home of the armed forces of the Third Reich, the Nazi Fort Knox as GIs would call it. Every German tanker spent a stint in training there. The German Army's elite tank training base was located at Paderborn, as was the SS's armor school. Personnel from these facilities marched out to join units holding the defensive line south of Paderborn. It was also reported that 2 training battalions of 30 to 40 Panther and Tiger tanks each joined the fight. To defend Paderborn, the SS had assembled SS Panzer Brigade Westfalen, a mixed battle group of troops from the SS, Army, Air Force, and Hitler Youth. Even battle-scarred instructors from both tank schools would be coming out to fight. For the most part, these defenders would pull out all the stops. On March 30th, resistance stiffened. The tankers of the combat commands immediately began to face heavy concentrations of bazooka men armed with Germany's deadly but unwieldy Panzerfaust tank killers. In Combat Command Reserve Sector, the town of Kirchborchen earned the nickname of Bazooka Town. German defenders began to use the Panzerfaust bazookas on a scale never before encountered by members of the Spearhead Division. The town was fortified and defended by more than 200 Hitler Youth and SS men, who sent the heavy rocket explosives from every conceivable angle, from attic windows, cellar hideouts, and piles of rubble. On the division right, Task Force Wellborn fought all day to clear the stubbornly defended towns of Heusen, Henglarn, and Edelen. As Task Force Wellborn moved north out of Edelen, well-concealed German tanks opened fire on them, stalling their advance. By 1600 hours, the skies had cleared sufficiently for General Rose and his small forward headquarters element, who had just reached Edelen, to call in airstrikes. After a few hours of pounding the German positions, the air support reported that the enemy tanks were destroyed. Task Force Wellborn commenced traveling again, seemingly unconcerned about any further danger on the road leading out of Edelen. What the Americans didn't know, though, was that only one enemy tank had been hit, and the rest retrograded to new positions deeper in the woods. Once the first 4 vehicles from Task Force Wellborn passed unknowingly through a kill zone, the Germans opened fire. Within minutes, 7 American tanks were ablaze. King Tiger tanks, previously thought to be destroyed in the airstrikes, engaged Task Force Wellborn at a range of 850 meters with deadly accuracy. It was a near-perfect ambush. Supporting SS infantry opened up with small arms fire from their positions on the high ground. General Rose was about a half-mile behind the burning column when he lost communications with Colonel Wellborn. Rose was concerned, but still didn't yet realize how precarious his own situation was. At the main command post, the Division Chief of Staff, Colonel John Smith, was worried after being unable to reach General Rose. Smith knew that Wellborn's column had been cut and that Rose's forward command post was nearby. Smith was temporarily relieved when General Rose was finally able to make contact, but that feeling was short-lived. Smith knew immediately that his earlier fears had been justified, as he could clearly hear sounds of battle in the background. General Rose's last radio words were, "Smith, send somebody to close up this column. We've been cut." It was a slaughter as the Germans began moving down the hill to finish the job. Before it was over, at least 17 M4 Sherman tanks, 17 armored half-tracks, and numerous other vehicles were destroyed. Dozens of peeps, trucks, ambulances, and other vehicles lay on the road in a terrible tangle of death and destruction. Task Force Wellborn had been annihilated. In the midst of the ever-increasing destruction ahead of them, General Rose and his senior officers soon realized the danger they now faced. Rose decided they must attempt to link up with Colonel Wellborn and whatever was left of his command. Their only hope for survival was to go cross-country, evade the enemy, and get to the main road. Just after 1930 hours, with the last traces of daylight rapidly fading, the small command caravan moved out in the direction where they thought Task Force Wellborn had gone. At virtually the same moment, 4 King Tiger tanks were moving down the same road towards the Hamborn intersection. The two unsuspecting groups collided. Colonel Brown, the division artillery commander, was in the lead vehicle when one of his passengers saw what was in front of them. "Holy shit, it's a Tiger! Get off the road!" Brown quickly scanned the terrain and made his move, deciding that the only course was to run the gauntlet before the Germans recovered from their surprise. Brown's driver swerved around 4 enemy tanks, barely squeezing past the last one, losing a side gas can in the process. General Rose's aide, Major Robert Bellinger, at first glance thought the tanks were American, but once he saw Colonel Brown's peep dart around the other tanks, his demeanor turned to sudden shock and fear. "My God, General, we've had it! Those are German Tigers!" The general's driver, Technician 4 Glenn Chauncey, hit the gas and swerved around the first 2 tanks. Seeing his window closing fast, he tried to get around the 3rd tank, but the giant Tiger quickly turned into the peep and crushed it against one of the plum trees that lined the road. The hatch quickly flew open and the tank commander appeared, pointing the submachine gun at the 3 men. The German immediately began screaming at the Americans, who quickly got out of the peep with their hands in the air. 3 men didn't understand what the tank commander wanted them to do. Rose's driver suggested that the tank commander wanted their pistols. Rose agreed. Major Bellinger went first, removing his shoulder holster and setting his pistol on the tank. General Rose went next. As he unlatched the belt from around his hip, the tank commander opened fire. Chauncey screamed, "Run!" as he and Major Bellinger sprang away into the nearby ditch and began making their way quickly into the woods. General Maurice Rose was killed instantly. Shot 14 times, the general's body lay face up in the mud, his pistol lying by his side, still in its holster. The German force withdrew, not realizing that it had killed a division commander. It was Good Friday. The next morning, on March 31st, 2 sergeants from the 33rd Armored Regiment's Reconnaissance Company found Rose's body and recovered it back to the 3rd Armored Division headquarters. After breakfast, the division chief of staff, Colonel Smith, assembled the accompanying war correspondents and announced that General Maurice Rose had been killed in action. The news of General Rose's death was a shock to those both in Europe and back home in the United States. Most devastated by the news, though, were the men of the 3rd Armored Division. Hardened fighting men were reduced to tears. Tank gunner John Irwin noted that the men in the division took Rose's death quite personally, especially older combat veterans like his tank commander and loader. They didn't say much, but it was obvious from their somber curses and sullen demeanor that they were crushed and vengeful. Later in the afternoon, Irwin recalled that they were briefed by their company commander, who made it clear to them that this enemy was completely nuts and would commit any atrocity or make any sacrifice for the Führer. Now I'm required to say this, his commander continued. We really don't want any more prisoners than necessary. Now listen good. I'm not telling you to shoot men who are surrendering. Everyone got that? Just because the Krauts have no consciences doesn't mean that we don't either. Any questions? Good. Now let's give them some payback. When Andy Rooney heard that Maurice Rose was killed the day after his interview with him, Rooney recalled feeling as if he'd lost a friend. He wasn't a friend, but he made me feel that way in our conversation. Niceness is not an attribute they instill in generals at West Point, but he and Leon W. Johnson were very nice generals. Rose's immediate boss, General J. Lawton Collins, commander of the U.S. 7th Corps, was equally taken aback. In his autobiography published more than 3 decades after the war, Collins dedicated many pages chronicling and praising the exploits of Rose and his Spearhead division. Reflecting on General Rose's death, Collins wrote, Maurice Rose was the top armored commander in the Army when he was killed. Tall, handsome, always dressed immaculately, even in combat. He was a commanding figure who claimed instant respect from officers and men alike. Somewhat stern and wholly dedicated to defeating the Nazis, perhaps because of his Jewish origin, which I learned about only after his death. He was not given to easy comradeship, yet I came to have a great respect and affection for him. I will always remember him as he met me one day on the Cologne Plain, outside of a CP located in an exposed house at the very end of a small town. Maurice, I said, do you always have to have your CP in the last house in town? He drew himself up as he replied, General, there is only one way I know how to lead this division, and that's at the head of it. And that's how he died, at the head of his Spearhead division. God rest his soul. Probably the most intimate story recorded on General Rose's death came from Captain Daniel Magnuson, a 3rd Armored Division liaison officer. A liaison officer was sent to other unit headquarters that the 3rd Armored Division was working for or with to coordinate future and present operational plans and unit locations. During the attack towards Paderborn, Captain Magnuson was assigned as a liaison to the 104th Infantry Division under Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. Captain Magnuson was woken during the night of March 30th. General Terry Allen wanted to see him at once. I have a partly garbled message from 7th Corps, and I can't get any confirmation from any source on this, Allen told Magnuson. 7th Corps reports that General Rose has been killed. Do you know anything about this? Captain Magnuson told General Allen that he knew nothing of the report, but doubted it could be true. General Allen asked if Magnuson could drive up to the 3rd Armored Division headquarters and find out. I'm very concerned about my friend. I hate to ask you to do this, but I must find out somehow. Captain Magnuson and his driver made it through a harrowing trip in the middle of the night, through multiple friendly roadblocks, luckily unharmed, and were eventually able to locate the 3rd Armored Division headquarters. As Magnuson walked into the building, he found his boss, Colonel Smith, slumped in a chair with a sad, dour expression on his face. He knew immediately the report was true. Colonel Smith then sat Captain Magnuson down and told the story of General Rose's death as he knew it at that time. Captain Magnuson returned to the 104th headquarters, and as instructed before he left, woke General Allen up to update him on the situation. Magnuson recalled what happened next in an article he wrote in 1988. I found him in his shorts, just crawling out of his sleeping bag. As he stood, he motioned me to sit on one end of his bunk. He asked if the message had been true. I told him it was. His whole body paused and then sagged down onto his bunk. He slowly pulled his knees up to his chin, clasped his hands over his knees, and rested his head on his hands. He stared at the wall of his trailer for about a minute, then large tears coursed down his tan, swarthy cheeks. As oblivious to me, he mourned his longtime friend. About 6 or 7 minutes passed while I silently sat with General Allen, hardly breathing and wondering what, if anything, I could do to ease his pain. Unable to think of anything, I continued to sit, feeling as out of place as a prostitute in church. After finally composing himself, General Allen asked Captain Magnuson if he could deliver a letter to General Doyle Hickey, who assumed command of 3rd Armored Division immediately following Rose's death. Allen then proceeded to dictate a letter describing the long relationship between himself and General Rose, his deep personal regrets over the Spearhead's loss, the marvelous spirit of cooperation between the two divisions, and assured General Hickey of continued support by the 104th Division in the future. Despite the tragic news of General Rose's death, there was no slacking off in the 3rd Armored Division as it continued its desperate fight to capture Paderborn. Tough fighting raged on for the next 2 days, culminating on April 1st, Easter Day. The original plan for attacking Paderborn called for the commitment of 2 relatively fresh task forces of Combat Command A, who would pass through Combat Command Reserve and attack the western part of the city. Combat Command B would continue their attack north and clear the eastern side of Paderborn. Before this attack could be launched, though, orders came from higher that necessitated changes in the plan. At 0300 hours on April 1st, General Collins ordered the 3rd Armored Division to send a force to Lippstadt, some 20 miles to the west, where they would link up with elements of the 2nd Armored Division, which had broken out of the U.S. 9th Army's Rhine bridgehead and was driving rapidly eastward on the north side of the Ruhr district. Before first light, Task Force Kane was redirected to the northwest, where at 1530 hours, they made physical contact with elements of the 41st Armored Infantry Regiment from the 2nd Armored Division. The Great Ruhr Pocket was closed, trapping over 740,000 enemy soldiers. Significantly, the U.S. First Army announced that the mass encirclement would henceforth be known as the Ruhr Pocket, in honor of the great general who was killed in action, leading this decisive victory over Germany. Meanwhile, in Paderborn, the rest of the 3rd Armored Division battled to eradicate the fanatical defenders of the city. Tank gunner John Irwin recalled looking over the city before moving in for the attack. By the gray light of the early cloud morning, we can see fire and smoke creating a weird, phantasmagoric scene above the city of Paderborn. The city had been and was being pounded by Allied fighters and shell fire, and was suffering serious destruction. I stood with my head out of the turret hatch. Joe, my tank gunner, was standing on the back deck behind the turret. Wow, was all that I could manage. Joe chewed on his cigar. Pretty damn impressive, don't you think, as he watched. They're beaten, but they don't know it. That's a bad kind of enemy. Bunch of f***ing fanatics. Despite the incessant bombardment and strafing, the German forces at Paderborn came out of the city on the attack. Tanks, tank destroyers, self-propelled guns, everything they could pull together. We moved off the road and across the muddy fields to engage them. I heard Joe's voice on the intercom saying, "We're going to flank them. We'll get it from the front and both sides. Keep it loaded, Pete. Kid, keep your face to that sight." The German armor formed a line of defense ahead of us and began showing enormous firepower. I could see some of what was going on, but not much. The ride was rough. Several times our driver got stuck in the gooey mud, but was able to back us out and move on. All of the American tanks were firing at the Germans, and they in turn were unleashing everything on us they could muster, which was tremendous. Joe picked the targets, and I tried to hit them. On the western side of town, the tankers and infantrymen assigned to Task Force X and Combat Command A commenced what seemed like a near-suicidal attack on the Paderborn airport. The terrain was at least 1.5 to 2 miles wide. Wide open, level terrain with no cover whatsoever. Craters dotted the field from earlier air and artillery fire. The task force had not made it 200 feet before all hell broke loose. The tanks fanned out to put some distance between each other. As they began encountering the bomb craters, the doughboys riding on top of the tanks quickly saw that most were filled with Germans. Manning machine guns and Panzerfausts, these fanatical defenders immediately let loose, surprising the attackers. German 88mm anti-tank guns and 20mm flak weapons also opened up, inflicting heavy casualties on the Americans. Les Baver was a Company A veteran who took part in the attack on the Paderborn airport. The following clip is from an interview he gave to his fellow Company A veteran, Bob Pacious.
I guess Paderborn was pretty rough, wasn't it?
That was it.
Yeah.
I remember the chaplain walking alongside the tank and he said, "Today's Easter." We didn't even know what tank. One day was the same as the next. I mean, the whole squad got it.
Yeah.
The shell hit right in the top of the tank. I guess it was a bazooka or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know I got knocked out.
Did you get hit there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where'd you get hit?
In the face and
okay.
And I had a piece in here, and I think in the leg I had it.
Yeah.
Just small stuff.
Yeah.
I seen Hodgins land when I come to.
Okay. Did anybody get killed there in your squad?
Belfort.
At that time?
I'm pretty sure that's when Belfort got killed.
Okay.
Well, right after we went up over the bank, we got it. We didn't get very far.
You want a tank?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were riding tanks.
Yeah. And you say it was a bazooka?
I think it was.
Okay.
Something hit the top of the tank, and I passed out. I just took a deep breath, and when Irwin on, I was out.
Yeah. So obviously you bounced off the tank onto the ground. Do you know what happened? Excuse me. You know what happened to the tank?
It was burning, I know.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, yeah. And so the guys who were on that tank, they got hit. Bellflower got killed.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure he was killed there.
Yeah, and then
see, them guys took the load. I was the last guy crawled on.
Oh, I see.
And it hit on the 50, on top of the 50.
Oh,
I
boy.
remember right.
Yeah.
And then they got it because some of them were standing up and shooting at down the ditch, you know.
Company A of the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment rode into battle along with E Company, 32nd Armored Regiment, which included one of the brand new M26 Super Pershing tanks. Malcolm Buck Marsh Jr. found himself riding into battle on top of the Pershing tank.
But we started into that town, as best I can remember, or city, with probably a battalion of tanks, which would have been 51. Because I know our company and C Company both, the C Company was on our right, but both of us were in the assault group. The airfield had been bombed very heavily by us and the British and had an awful lot of big bomb craters in it. And in those bomb craters were quite a few Germans with Panzerfausts, and they would let the tanks get about even with them and then start shooting. Probably the worst fire we took, though, I guess it was some type of 20 or 40 millimeter cannon, multi-barrel, twin barrels or 4 barrels that the Germans were shooting at us with. And I know one tank got a direct hit on it, and if I'm not mistaken, this is where a fellow from Tennessee named Franklin was killed. He wasn't in our squad, but somebody told me later on that he got a direct hit from that. I remember him very well. Prior to that, some German horses had been captured by us, and everybody was scared to death of them, as wild as they could be, and he rode those damn things and just took care of them, and he was just, undoubtedly he had grown up taking care of horses back in Tennessee. Nevertheless, as we were going across this airfield, it was obvious that we were taking a pretty good pounding because some of our tanks were getting hit, and 2 or 3 of the guys on our tank jumped off because we had slowed down, but then we speeded up, and one fella in our squad, Richardson, was holding on to the tank, and he was trying to keep up with it running, and it just looked like his legs were coming right out of his shoulders. They were making a 360-degree turn, and we were dragging him through wire and everything else. Finally, we slowed down long enough for him to get back on. We got into the edge of town, and I remember there was a little road and a couple of houses, just frame houses, and the Germans had foxholes around this house facing us, and we just came in too quickly for them, and they all they had were rifles, and we had tanks staring them in the face, and some of them were giving up. But one of the guys in our squad jumped in a hole with one of them and got him out. I think it was Luther Jones. But the German, there was a hell of a lot of shooting going on all this time, and we finally got the German to get out, and he handed me his rifle, and I threw it away.
Company A eventually made it across the airport and established a small foothold in the town, clearing out the first couple of houses they came upon. Captain Walter Berlin, the Company A commander, made his way into the same house the 3rd Platoon members had gathered and immediately tried to gain some semblance of order. Only 5 tanks had made it into Paderborn at that time, and more than half of Company A was killed, wounded, or still out in the bomb craters with the knocked-out tank crews. After a brief radio conversation, Captain Berlin announced to those in the house that 2 German Tiger tanks were proceeding down the road towards their location. He instructed Lieutenant Boom, platoon leader for 3rd Platoon, to take his men across the railroad tracks a few blocks away and secure that approach. Lieutenant Boom left a few soldiers to stay with Captain Berlin and went off on his mission. Buck Marsh was in this group and recorded his story decades later. Editor note: the name of the field artillery observer described in this clip is wrong. After further research by the Company A historian Dan Langens, it was determined that his actual name was Lieutenant Sarver and not Lieutenant Sunslimmer.
Lieutenant Boom took our platoon, which was undermanned at that time, or part of the platoon. I guess maybe there were 15 or 20 of us, or more than that maybe. But anyhow, we went down behind this house toward a series of railroad tracks. There must have been, 15, 20 tracks down there. And we came upon a switch house. We found out later it was a real tall, maybe 40-foot high brick building. It's just about 20 or 25 feet square. And we went into it, and it was real thick walls, so we felt fairly secure in there. And at that time, the forward observer with us was a Lieutenant Sunslimmer. I had mentioned earlier that Lieutenant Hart had been wounded. Well, Z.T. Burton with our squad and Sunslimmer went up some steel-grated steps to a steel grate floor above us, and a shot rang out, and they came flying back down the steps and reported that a German sniper was out there in one of the, it was a gondola type, an open top box car that had, open type car that had some kind of iron ore in it, and Burton seemed to think that the crowd had dug a damn foxhole up in that boxcar. But anyhow, that's where he was when he shot at him, and luckily he didn't hit anybody.
Lieutenant Boom then came into the switchyard building from a dead run to inform the men that a loud tank battle was taking place back in the vicinity of Captain Berlin's command post. Nevertheless, Boom wanted to continue with his mission of crossing those railroad tracks come higher hell water, because those were Captain Berlin's orders to him. Lieutenant Boom was an imposing figure, 6'2", well-built, with an engaging smile. His very presence commanded discipline and respect. His aggressiveness was described by some of his men as plumb spooky and frightening at times, but he never asked his troops to do anything he wouldn't do or couldn't do himself. Lieutenant Boom asked if anyone had been upstairs, and Burton had told him about their encounter with the German sniper. Seeing the look on Boom's face, Burton pleaded with his platoon leader. "Sir, don't go near that window. He has it zeroed in."
Lieutenant Boom had been off somewhere with somebody. He came in, he was trying to find a way to get across those railroad tracks. He just couldn't stand it because we were sitting still and weren't moving on toward our objective. And Burton told him or reported to him what had happened to he and Sunslimmer, that, he really didn't need to go upstairs. But knowing Boom as I do, I can understand him. He went straight upstairs and undoubtedly looked out that window, and when he did, the sniper hit him right in the throat. And his steel helmet clattered on those steps, and that's steel grate. And Lieutenant Sunslimmer went upstairs and came back immediately to report that Lieutenant Boom had been killed. And that was an awful empty feeling for me, I guess for most of the other guys too, but I had worked awful close with Lieutenant Boone ever since he had been there, because he was a great deal of support to me while I was first scout, because he didn't bother him damn bit. It didn't seem like to be right up there amongst everything that was going on. And a lot of times when I was having some trouble motivating myself to keep on moving, he'd come up there and he didn't lead with a lot of speeches. Hell, he led by doing things himself. So he made my life a little bit easier over there.
Buck Marsh and the rest of the 3rd Platoon made their way back to Captain Berlin's headquarters. When they got there, they found the 2 Tiger tanks knocked out within a block of the company command post. The crew of the M26 Pershing were out of their tanks all smiles after surviving a very intense engagement in which they were able to get the better of the German monsters. A few 3rd Platoon soldiers walked over to get a closer look at the destroyed Tiger tanks. The crew of 1 tank were all killed after taking a 90mm round from the Pershing through its side. The 2nd Tiger tank's barrel was completely knocked off the turret, disabling it permanently. The German tank crew, unable to defend themselves any longer, immediately opened the hatch and waved a white flag. They were taken into custody. Byron Mitchell, Buck Marsh, and a few other 3rd Platoon soldiers were listening to the story of the tank battle when they saw an American tanker suddenly knock a captured German tank commander to the ground. He kicked him a few times, then drew his .45 pistol from his shoulder holster, chambering a round. The German tank commander fell to his knees and began pleading for his life. Suddenly, Byron Mitchell ran towards them, shouting, "Hold up! Don't shoot him!" The tanker looked at Byron in disbelief and exclaimed, "What the hell, boy? Are you a kraut lover?" "No, but this German officer saved my life, along with 8 or 10 other GIs last week." "Come on, man," the tanker said. "Ain't no kraut officer gonna save GIs." "Well, this one did, and if you get that damn gun out of my face, I'll tell you about it, and then you decide what to do." Byron Mitchell retold the story of his and the other 3rd Platoon soldiers captured days earlier, about how they were given shovels and told to dig holes, which Byron, along with the other soldiers, were sure to be their burial places when shot. And then when digging their graves, a column of German tanks arrived and the tank commander got out and saved their lives by having the guards move them into a farmhouse instead of shooting them. "Now it's my time to return the favor and ask you not to harm this German," Byron told the tanker. "But you don't understand. This Kraut and his fellow killers have destroyed our battalion of tanks today. On top of that, yesterday these Tigers, along with 3 others, destroyed an entire company of 17 half-tracks and 5 tanks." To which Byron replied, "Killing him won't bring any of our GIs back. Besides, he won't be doing any more fighting." "Are you sure this is the same Kraut that saved your life?" "Sure, I'm sure. How could you not remember someone who saved your life?" Dejected, the tanker then barked out, "Okay, but you better get him out of my sight before I change my mind." The German tank commander spoke English, so he was following the conversation very intently. As he walked towards the other 8 or 10 German prisoners some 30 feet away, he suddenly stopped, turned around, and walked back to Byron. He touched him on the arm, thanking him with a faint smile. As Byron Mitchell headed back to the company command post, he reflected on both the strain and effort he just exerted in convincing the American tanker to save the German officer. Adding to the unbelievable situation, he had just come face to face with his German savior. The moment was too much for Byron. With his face already terribly pale, he stopped, sat down, and began to shake. If you enjoyed listening to our show, I'm asking if you could take a few moments to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast player. This simple step is the best way for you to help new listeners find the show. Please join us next week as we fast forward 6 decades for part 2 and share a company commander's harrowing story of leading his team from Kuwait to Baghdad.